Hello, and welcome to my presentation on heather moorlands in the Highlands of Scotland. I'm Katie Starr, and today I'll be proposing a research study of heather moorlands. By looking at landscape drivers for heather health, we can adjust best practices for conservation and land management in the light of climate change. You can find in any guidebook about Scotland a description of heather, Paulownia vulgaris, a small evergreen flowering shrub that is native to moors, dunes, bogs, heaths, and hillsides. Heather can be found throughout Europe and parts of North America and Asia. In optimal growing conditions, it will form thick mats of vegetation that can dominate the landscape. In the Highlands of Scotland, heather is different from other Scottish dwarf shrubs by its tiny leaves, about 1 to 2 millimeters long, which hug the woody stems like shoots and are sometimes indistinguishable at first glance. When in bloom, the pinkish-purple flowers line the shoot tips from August to September, which is prime tourist time in the Highlands. Preserving heather moorlands is critical because they are one of the most distinctive habitats found in Europe, and they are seen as a cultural landscape in the Highlands of Scotland. Heather moorlands also have considerable economic and tourist-related value as well. According to the BBC, red deer stalking and driven grouse shooting alone bring the Highlands millions of pounds sterling per year. Heather is a highly valued food source for domesticated sheep, red deer, and red grouse, as well as a habitat for many other wildlife. In addition to these interests, heather moorlands store large amounts of carbon, providing an enormously valuable ecosystem service. In this study, I will be looking at which landscape drivers are most critical for heather moorland health, and if the land use policies and practices being used in the Highlands of Scotland today are most beneficial for the long-term heather moorland health. These questions are important because livestock grazing and controlled burns are, and have been for generations, the main practices used for the conservation and management of heather moorlands. But very little large-scale research has been done in the Highlands to see if these are the best practices for using on moorlands, specifically in the Highlands. There have been smaller studies in other parts of Scotland and the UK and in mainland Europe that look at both grazing and burning impacts on heather growth, but there have not been any that look at how large-scale landscape drivers affect heather moorland health in the Highlands. For this study, I am proposing a large-scale landscape driver study. I will be looking at the entirety of the Highland Council, shown here in red, which is approximately 25,000 square kilometers. I would be examining historical geospatial data gathered from 1990 to 2020. This data would include aerial surveys, hyperspectral remote sensing, and ground photos coupled with a historic land policy and practices that were used throughout the Highlands, and particularly on heather moorland. You can see both wet and dry heather moorlands are the predominant landscape or land cover in the Highlands, shown here in the various shades of purple and pink on this map. And for the purpose of this study, we would be looking at all of the heather moorlands, both wet and dry, within the Highland Council boundaries. I would analyze the historical geospatial data with all of the ground truthing data I could find during the set time frame. This may prove challenging, though, since I'm looking back over 30 years. There may be gaps in the data. By using historical digital elevation models and hyperspectral data, along with the Investigating Climate Change and Remote Sensing project as a guide, I believe I have enough tools to create a comprehensive timeline for the Highlands. Once I have all this data, I would be able to overlay the land use policy and practices for each location and be able to tell if the practices have been effective over the last 30 years. By knowing which landscape drivers are needed to create the healthiest heather moorland in the Highlands, we can adjust policy and practices to better address the issues of land use and climate change now and hopefully into the future. I'm expecting to find that while rotation grazing and controlled burns are useful in some areas, in others they are not. This will be where the hyperspectral imaging will come in to tell us what has changed over the years in the ecosystem composition. If habitat has been lost in some areas but not in others, and the same drivers are in play, more research may be needed into what is causing the habitat loss. If rotation, grazing, and controlled burns are not as universally helpful for heather moorland health, what is? Land use policy and practices will need to be changed to fit the local landscape needs. In just the last few years, there appears to be an interest in carbon sinks in moorlands, but there was not a lot of research looking at carbon sinks in heather moorlands in the Highlands in particular. So more research is needed here, as I believe this will be the main driver for heather health in the most recent years. The image I have here is from Longmire in Shropshire, England. This land used the prescribed grazing and burning practices, but there is still habitat loss. Clearly, there is something else at play at the landscape affecting heather health. I wish I could find similar images for the Highlands, but I could not. So that's what this project is for. I've never done a research project quite like this before, and I really struggled with finding the right way to gather and analyze data. Once Dr. Bickford pointed me in the right direction of remote sensing, I felt more at ease with how my ideas were coming together, but I continued to struggle with the idea of finding a specific program to suggest in my proposal. I've never used any remote sensing or mapping software before. By not having a familiarity with how these systems work, I wasn't sure which to choose, and from the apparently 100 variable in the field of landscape ecology. After I found the hyperspectral remote sensing, I feel like this would best fit for the information I was trying to gather, but I feel it's still very much guesswork at this point, and I have no idea how to actually use the software. I also struggled with balancing the idea of finding research to support my proposal and actually doing the research for a full project. I got lost many times down fascinating rabbit holes, and these rabbit holes will be incredibly useful if I actually do this research project later in my career, but they were not nearly as helpful as I thought they'd be for this proposal. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Please leave questions, comments, and feedback in the discussion thread. Your feedback has been invaluable this semester, and it definitely helps me learn and improve. So thank you so much. References are on the following slide. Thank you.